Hello and welcome to the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Laura Kramer. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here at Midori House and from around the world. Coming up this week, a year after Hamas militants launched an unprecedented cross-border attack on Israel, we discuss how October 7th changed the Middle East forever. Then Vladimir Putin signs a decree for tens of thousands to join Russia's military. We'll ask how many will answer his call. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes.
She might be prone to have weapons inside the apartment. Right now, we just don't know.
We'll go for a ride-along with the Dallas PD as we turn our attention to the role of policing in the U.S. presidential campaign. Then,
our goal is 2028 for the mammoth. We have not set a timeline for the dodo, externally I should say. But what I will say is that it is highly likely we will see an animal before the mammoth.
We'll decode the past as we meet the co-founder of a company using ancient DNA to bring back extinct species. All that and much, much more over the next hour here on The Curator with me, Laura Kramer. On October 7th, Israel will observe the first anniversary of the worst day of its 76-year history. On that day last year, Hamas broke out of the confines of Gaza and embarked on a killing spree that left nearly 1,200 dead and thousands injured. 251 people were kidnapped and taken hostage, of whom several dozen remain captive. On the Foreign Desk this Saturday, our host Andrew Muller spoke with Mina Al-Oraibi, editor-in-chief at The National in Abu Dhabi. She began by describing how the Hamas attack first landed in her own newsroom as they started to understand what had happened on October 7th.
Of course, it happened over a weekend, and so many newsrooms were half-staffed, and very quickly we realized, no, this is going to be a major moment. And we knew, of course, there'd be major repercussions also, not only in Gaza, but on the region. So again, like every newsroom in the region, we immediately started flooding back to the newsroom and trying to understand what exactly happened. And one of the surprises was how extensive the attacks were and for how long the Hamas attack continued in Israel before measures were taken to stop it. And so as it started to unfold, what was clear was that this was an attack that was coordinated for quite some time. But the assumption amongst many was that Iran or Hezbollah would come in also, that there would be a wider attack on Israel because surely...
This was the beginning of something coordinated.
Yeah, there was an idea that it would be coordinated because surely for Hamas to take on such a bold attack, the response from the Israelis and the Israeli military was always going to be extreme. And so the idea was this the beginning of this wider regional war that Iran had often threatened with different proxies. And it seemed in the first few days that that was not going to happen, that instead this was Hamas had been able to keep this under wraps because very few people even knew it was going to happen outside of Gaza. And perhaps that was the reason they were able to pull it off. So there were many, many questions being asked in those first hours, but there was a collective acknowledgement that this was a major moment.
Because that all touches on one, or what strikes me at least, as one of the great unanswered questions, and it is a question I have put to a lot of people and have not yet had a concise answer, really, which is, why did Hamas do this? Because, as you've correctly said, there was only ever going to be one level of Israeli response, as there always is, and it was obviously going to be of an order of magnitude even more severe than usual, given the scale of this attack. So Hamas presumably had some idea of what they thought this was going to accomplish other than what it has accomplished. Has it ever been clear to you what that is?
It's hard to understand how they thought the response would be anything but that. And the fact that they hadn't prepared their own people. You know, you have Gazans who have said, you know, there are no shelters, there are no tunnels. There wasn't even a stock of extra food or medicines or anything to try to get through an oncoming war. It's hard to understand what they thought would happen in the long term, but it isn't hard to understand why they did it, in the sense that it seemed that Israel and Saudi Arabia were moving towards a possible deal, and that in the minds not only of Hamas, but in the minds of many Palestinians, would have meant really the end of a pursuit of an independent Palestinian state. Saudi diplomats and officials insist that they would not have come to an agreement or a deal with Israel unless there was a clear path forward for a two-state solution. But they didn't say that they would make sure that there was a Palestinian state before signing a deal with Israel.
Is it also possible that Hamas surmised that that two-state solution that might have been part of a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia would have very little room in it for Hamas, whom, of course, the Saudis are not big fans?
Yes. And it's clear that Hamas were increasingly isolated from most Arab capitals. They were getting closer to Iran, who became their biggest backer. Of course, a major moment for Hamas was when the uprising in Syria happened and Hamas decided to take a position against the Syrians, moved both to Qatar and Turkey. And so there were different iterations of Hamas, let's say, but what was clear was that Hamas had become very close to Iran and was of a belief that they had to fight their way against Israel, that there wasn't going to be a peace accord that would have room for them, or frankly, that the current Israeli administration or the political factions in Israel appeared serious in terms of having a proper Palestinian state. Having said that, Hamas themselves, to this day, are at different ends of the spectrum from the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, which runs the West Bank. So you're right to question whether a deal between the Saudis and Israelis, even if it led to a Palestinian state, would have room for Hamas. And that is true. It's hard to know also what opportunity Hamas felt they had on that particular date, the 7th of October, 2023, where they felt they could actually carry out militarily that attack, that perhaps they wouldn't have that window in other times. And I think that's also something to take into account. That's they may have had these plans, and it was just when was the moment that they could actually strike, and they felt that that was the opportunity. So while the bigger geopolitical play may have been a greater motivator, Hamas has always wanted to put as much pressure or damage on Israel as possible, and it was that moment that they were able to carry out the attack. I think it was also very important for Hamas to be able to take away the idea that the Israeli Iron Dome, that the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence was invincible. And they showed a weakness and a vulnerability in Israel that not only has affected, of course, the psyche of the Israeli population, but actually regionally, questions started to be asked about how strong really was this military intelligence that the Israelis had, and that up until that point had been able to deflect Hamas, Hezbollah, and others.
Nevertheless, though, is it fair, do you think, because this is just a thought that has struck me repeatedly over the last year, that interestingly, Israel's response to Hamas's attack seems, though obviously it has caused an amount of outrage and upset in the Arab world, it hasn't so much hardened Arab states against Israel as hardened Arab states against Iran. That has been the upshot of it, to the extent that when Iran launched that enormous aerial barrage at Israel, it was intercepted in part by Jordanian fighter planes and with the help of Saudi intelligence.
This is one of many complications of the region, because for many Arab states, they're between having to deal with Israel and the continued occupation of Palestine, which not only do the governments care about, but even more so their people care about. On the flip side, you've got Iran that works actively to undercut the sovereignty of Arab states like Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, where be it through paramilitary groups, be it through making pronouncements like we call the shots in four Arab capitals and so forth. And so I think the position of most Arab governments is that they don't want to see Iran in a position that it's able to call the shots in several Arab capitals and rising. And I think for the Jordanians, that moment to intercept was if they hadn't, then very soon you could see a downward spiral where Iran decides to send militants from Iraq through Jordanian borders to try to get to the West Bank. So I think for the Jordanians, this is another red line that's being crossed when it comes to their own sovereignty, that if they allowed it to happen, would likely lead to a further attempt to undercut Jordanian sovereignty. And so I think it isn't so much about they can live with Israel, but they can't live with Iran. It's more about how much of a threat is this for their own internal dynamics? And for the Iranians to be able to intercept their airspace, the fear is that the next step is that we'll intercept their land.
And it's off to Russia now, where the country's men are being called up again with plans to draft up to 133,000 of them between now and January next year. The president, Vladimir Putin, signed a decree earlier this week as part of the regular autumn conscription campaign. The bill also allows defendants to escape prosecution and scrap criminal proceedings against them if they enlist to go to war in Ukraine. Earlier this week, Emma Nelson was joined in the studio by Russia analyst Stephen Diel.
They want any young, fit men who, even if they have dodgy backgrounds, even if they've committed crimes, they need cannon fodder for the Russian army. So, as you said in your intro, the call-up happens at this time of the year anyway. But the big difference is this idea of people who are standing trial or are about to stand trial, instead of going ahead with the trial, can say, OK, I'll sign a contract with the Ministry of Defence and I'll go and serve in the army for a year.
This has happened before, hasn't it? I mean, not just during the 2022 onwards war, but didn't this happen in the Second World War as well?
Yes, because then, of course, also Russia desperately needed, or the Soviet Union desperately needed men. But it's become the norm in this war against Ukraine since September 2022, when the Wagner Group, remember them, they were signing up people from in prison. And some of the worst criminals, murderers, rapists, people serving long sentences were told, well, come and serve for 6 months in the army in Ukraine and you'll then go free. And we've already seen examples where that has caused problems because men who've survived and then gone back to their villages and have murdered and raped again. These are violent criminals. And this is one of the worrying things for Russian society, that you're releasing back into society, if they survive the war, if they're not just churned up in the as cannon fodder, which a lot of them are, but if they survive, they go back into an increasingly violent society. Now, one of the reasons they're doing it in this way, Putin just signing this decree to have 133,000 called up, making it look as if it's part of the normal call-up, but also in September 2022, he issued a mobilisation decree, so calling up more men than would otherwise have been the case.
And that led to a mass exodus, didn't it?
It led to a mass exodus, absolutely. We reckon probably about 1 million Russians left the country at that time because they didn't want to get called up. It's also led to a movement called The Way Home, Put Domoy, which they have a telegram presence. They've been described as a foreign agent, but they push on. This is women. These are women pushing for, in this case, mostly it's their husbands to be released, because those who were mobilised in 2022 are still there. They weren't called up just for a year or so. They've been called up. They've probably been given no leave. They're still fighting in Ukraine. Many of them obviously have been killed. So that's been a social movement, reflecting in some ways what happened during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Then it was soldiers' mothers. Now it's soldiers' wives. On the whole, or brothers, their brothers and sisters, it's their sisters saying, I want my brother to come home. So that's an undercurrent. They've tried to stamp down on it, and this is what they don't seem to care nowadays. They seem to think that if we frighten people enough, that will shut them up, and we will push through what we want.
Is that the narrative that is now being pushed through? Because people will start to be missed when you have hundreds of thousands of young men leaving communities, some of them not coming back, that has a profound societal influence, doesn't it?
It does. It's exactly what happened during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And I think that Putin has learned from that. And so, first of all, we must look back over the last 20 years and the propaganda that Putin has built up against Ukraine. This didn't start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014 when they seized Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. It starts long before that. Ukraine is getting more and more heavily criticised and being told that they're Nazis and they're going to invade they're going to invade Russia and we must defend our borders and so on. So that's been building up. So you've got that background. Then you've got the mobilisation. Then you've got a certain amount of discontent in society. And the way they now deal with that, apart from keeping the propaganda going and pushing people by saying, look, this is what we've got to do this to defend Russia, then it's fear. That's ultimately what they're coming down to is, that if you criticise the war, if you even call it a war, then you can be sent to prison for a long time. And those are not the sort of people who are now being released when they're saying, defendants. They're the sort of people who will go to prison. And those who are out-and-out criminals, rapists, murderers, thieves, and so on, are now being given the chance to say, actually, we'll stop your trial and you can go off to fight in the war, and if you come back, you're free.
Yes, I think the theory behind it is that they are repenting for their crimes through their military service.
Absolutely,
although it does sort of, and Russia being historically extremely sort of well renowned for its sort of approach to crime and justice, it's an interesting approach. Let's move focus a little now to the Russian state budget, which has not really hit the headlines. And there's a reason for that, isn't there?
There is a reason, yes, and it's not hit the headlines in the Russian press either because they really don't want people talking about it too much, because the Duma has just passed the law. It's got to be signed into law by Putin, but the budget, the national budget for 2025 to 2027 allows for 41%, yes, you heard that right, 41% of the budget to be spent on defence and security, and therefore obviously a lot of it on the war. Just to put that in perspective, NATO countries, NATO is being, Russia is always saying that NATO is a big enemy. NATO countries, of NATO countries, Poland pays the largest percentage share of its budget on defence, 4.1%. Exactly 10 times less than Russia is
and the NATO target for GDP contribution is what, 2?
Is 2%, yes. The Americans pay 3.4% and Estonia pay 3.4%. So that's Poland, Estonia and the US pay the largest percentage-wise. But and that 2%, Britain says, we pay the 2%, but it's smoke and mirrors. They put in military pensions, they put in housing. This is not all going on weapons or even salaries for soldiers. So to say 41% of the budget is going to be spent on defence and security, it's a huge amount.
What will that do for Russia?
It'll ruin the economy. In the long run. What all this underlines, yet again, the fact, criminals going back into society, the economy being shot to bits because it's all for the war effort, it all points to the fact that this war really against Ukraine, it's all about Putin keeping power. So you spend as much, you don't care about the welfare of the population, you don't give them better homes or better infrastructure or provide gas to everyone's home. It's probably only less than 50% of Russians have gas piped to their home, even though it's the biggest gas producer in the country. So you don't care about that. You care about staying in power. And then the way you do it ultimately, going back to what I said earlier, is fear. You make them fear that if they do protest, then they'll be put into prison, which is a very nasty experience in Russia.
There are other parts of the budget. I think the utility tariffs are going up by 12%. So Russians daily will be pushed and will be squeezed by this, won't they?
They will. Yes. No. Utility prices going up as well. State pensions are pretty low. In fact, a few years ago they raised the state pension age. Most Russians, if they're pensioners and they don't have savings, they have to rely on their family. You can't live on a Russian state pension. I mean, it's peanuts. So it's when looked at from the outside, you take all these things into account and you say, well, why aren't Russians rising up? Well, there's a certain amount of the Russian stoicism. They've always said that Russians will just grin and bear it and get on with it. But it comes down, again, I'm sorry to repeat it once more, but it is fear. Putin has created such a climate of fear in the country that people think protesting won't do any good, it'll just get me locked up. And we just knuckle down and get on with it. And many Russians will be thinking, we hope for better times. But they're not going to go out onto the streets to protest because that's not what they tend to do.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You're listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Laura Kramer. This week on The Briefing, we started our U.S. elections special, in which every Tuesday on the show will be dedicated to the presidential election until the big day on the 5th of November. We'll be zooming in on a particular issue that is dominating the campaign, and on the first edition, we're looking at the role of crime and policing, not necessarily as high of a priority as it was back in 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd, but a big issue nonetheless, and a problem that has only become more challenging since the pandemic. Monocle's U.S. editor, Chris Lord, has been riding along with the Dallas PD to get a sense of what they've managed to get right and what other police departments and even the White House can learn from them.
Can you repeat your element? Central North Dimension.
Badge is 7814.
It's high noon here in Dallas, Texas, and I'm in the backseat of an unmarked Dodge Charger of the Dallas Police Department. At the wheel is Major Jason Scoggins, and we're here to see a revolutionary violent crime plan being put into action.
There's a female at a nearby apartment complex, and she has an active warrant for manslaughter. She hit someone with her car. They ended up passing away as a result, and through the investigation, they have figured out who the suspect is. It's this female, and now there's a warrant issued in the title of manslaughter, which is a felony 3 warrant.
And the belief is that she's in one of these housing blocks that we're surrounded by at the moment. Is that right?
Yes. We have officers that are covert, so they're in regular street clothes, regular car. They're not undercover because they don't conduct business in an undercover capacity. Their main function is surveillance, and in this case, surveillance and confirmation of the suspect being at the location they believe her to be at. We will wait and see if she comes outside. She might be prone to have weapons inside the apartment. Right now, we just don't know. And so it is very dangerous to try to make entry on an apartment when you have the unknown behind the door.
Dallas has a violent history. Like many big cities in the US, there has been a complex, often troubled relationship between its police and the people they serve. Just in August, Officer Darren Burks was shot by a local man as he was sat in his squad car waiting between assignments. In the DPD's museum, there is a memorial to the 5 officers murdered in 2016 by a man seeking what was described at the time as payback for the death of black men in police custody around America. Nevertheless, in this election year, when public safety is high on voters' concerns, the success of Dallas's plan in reducing crime and restoring trust in the service has caught the eye of other cities. Police Chief Eddie Garcia is the plan's author.
There is not a community impacted by violent crime, whether in California or in the city of Dallas, regardless of language spoken, racial makeup, or economic status, that I ever heard the words, "We want to see less of you in our neighborhoods." I never heard it. And so when I would talk to some media outlets that they would talk to continue to, some media outlets would continue to try to drive this wedge that it was the police versus the community, I'm sitting there going, you may say that to other chiefs that work on their desks every day, but I'm out there.
Born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, Chief Garcia is a veteran of the San Jose Police Department in California and is the first person of Latino heritage to run Dallas's force. The plan he came up with has echoes of a few old ideas of hotspot policing, specifically those that were enacted in New York in the 1990s, but it updates them for our time mindful of criticism, especially from New York's African American communities, about the methods used at that time. He is seeing success.
Total violent crime in the city, including property crime, is down almost 11.5%. Property crime is down 11%, and violent crime is down almost 13.5%. We divided the city of Dallas into about 101,000 grids. There's 330 by 330 feet. We were able to treat at the time about 46 grids. It's a very, very small percentage, but they were responsible for approximately 10% of the city's overall violent crime. So the thinking was, if we reduce violent crime in those specific grids at the time, which was only in the mid-40s, that we will see reductions in violent crime citywide, which is exactly what we saw. Now, we made promises. We weren't going to conduct oversaturation. We weren't going to be doing stop and frisk. And one of the dynamics that's
which I should just say, both of which were figures of the kind of policing that we saw in New York in the 90s in Broken Windows Theory.
Yes. Because we treat our grids in two ways, by being visible and being present at certain times of the day, and by having intelligence-led policing at which individuals are responsible for violent crime and what root causes in those neighborhoods are responsible for violent crime. And so what we found is we not only found that we had massive reductions in our grids that led to reductions in the city's overall violent crime, but we were making less arrests citywide. And so being surgical that way and really trying to target the right areas really not only led to those reductions, but led to a lot of community trust.
Garcia believes that the success of his plan relies on building trust in the community in his cops. In 2023, polling company Gallup found that confidence in law enforcement across the US had dropped to 43%. According to the chief, restoring trust comes with transparency.
I want to find out where my blind spots are, where we need to get better before anybody else does. And so bringing in an outside expert, a criminologist, to look through, to have the knowledge base that he has seen what has occurred nationally in departments that have lost their way, and what did those departments go through, what were the issues that they had, so that we ensure we never lose our way. And so the Constitutional Policing Unit, particularly working with an outside source, really is giving ourselves our own patterns of practice investigation. Everyone should have this type of unit. I want to do things and change the department before someone tells me to.
What would you like to see in the next administration in their attitude towards justice and addressing some of these things at a federal level that we've just been talking about?
From a national perspective, we need to go back to accountability. I think people need to go into neighborhoods. And I'm not talking about talking to special interest groups, and I'm talking about go into impacted neighborhoods, hear what they want. So these rogue DAs that are around the country that are not prosecuting crimes, the irresponsible decisions made by judges with regards to bail and bond on individuals that have committed gun crimes. We cannot look in the mirror and say we take gun crime seriously in this country, while individuals that we know have committed gun crime that my men and women risk their lives to arrest are back out on the street in 2 weeks. Those are things that I would love to be looked at the federal level.
Eddie Garcia. Defund the police, according to him, is a ridiculous idea. But those who marched and protested under that slogan in 2020 and beyond would argue that they are just concerned citizens, worried about heavy-handed policing, which too often has turned deadly in America. So what do those in Dallas, the communities themselves, make of the plan? Anton Lucky, a former gang member who spent time in prison, is president of Urban Specialists, an organisation that brings law enforcement into communities to talk to local people about their concerns.
We did the first ever gang peace treaty with the Bloods and Crips here in Dallas, where we had over 400 gang members to sign a peace, and that became the foundation of the work that we do today. If you bring people together and they have proximity, whether it's gangs, whether that's politicians, whether that's law enforcement, if you bring them close together, we can find a commonality, then ultimately we can have safe communities.
Right over the road from where we are is the Dallas Police Department headquarters. Since 2021, they released a violent crime reduction plan. Give me your appraisal of that, Anton. What you make about that plan?
Well, you got a chief who is willing to not be just behind the desk, but walk to neighborhoods, go to neighborhoods and meet with people and hear their concerns. then you own to something. We are strategically aligned, right? And our job is to bring the law enforcement together with community in a way that it ain't been done across the country, right? It ain't been all good. I don't want to make it seem like it's been all good, because Chief Garcia is just one person. This mentality that he has to go down through the 3,500 or 3,400 men that look up to him. And sometimes it's not well received. If you look at his track record, he disciplined his officers. And the same, when you look at urban specialists, what we do, when there's an incident, we have people in our community who are doing some stuff, we stand firmly against that. And I think that's the trust building process. During the height of George Floyd, I say this, we did over 2,800 surveys. And we asked specific questions, right, about policing. And 93 of the respondents on those surveys at the height of George Floyd said that we wanted more police. We just don't want to be profiled and harassed, but we want police in our community so we can feel safe. In the nightly news, you don't hear that. You only hear defund the police. So we wanted to bring to the light the voices of the neighborhood people who live in these communities.
The next administration, whoever that might be, if you were going into the White House, what would you say to them on day one about restoring that trust in public safety and making people feel more safe in their communities?
We should make it imperative that we establish Office of Violence Prevention offices in all of the country and use the model that you see here in Dallas. But I believe if we have an administration in the White House that takes this serious, I think that in probably 5, maybe 10 years from now, every city in America can see a drop in reduction of violence. Because there are individuals in every city that I go to who are working to address this problem.
For Monocle in Dallas, Texas, I'm Chris Lord.
Now, more than 30 years ago, Jurassic Park captivated audiences with its thrilling tale of cloning dinosaurs from ancient DNA. While that was purely science fiction, could today's technology actually bring extinct species back to life? For the entrepreneurs, I caught up with Ben Lamb, the CEO and co-founder of Colossal, to uncover the real science behind de-extinction and the company's ambitious plan to revive the woolly mammoth by 2028. He began by telling me what the company actually does.
Colossal is the world's first de-extinction and species preservation company. And our focus is really twofold. One, bringing back these iconic species like the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, and the dodo. That's probably what we're most known for. But also developing technologies that can help human healthcare, as well as developing technologies that can help conservation, which we're very, very excited about. People just think of it as the lab, right? They're like, oh, it's just a bunch of really smart people in lab coats. And there is a lot of that, right? But a lot of this actually is like we're going down into the archives of museums and getting museum samples, right? You know, I don't know if there's another movie other than Indiana Jones, but it has this like weird Indiana Jones component to it where it's like you're literally in like the catacombs of a old museum or the Smithsonian, and then you're constantly like in like the tundra, like digging up frozen mammoth pieces. So there is this like discovery component of it that feels a little bit like the movie.
It is a radical concept, and the Jurassic Park aspect that you bring into it. Actually, I read an article recently. It was about the dodo and everything, and they were explaining that actually, well, you can't bring back dino DNA because it's so old.
That's correct. We don't want to break hearts. I don't want to get a Reddit group after me. Our chief science officer at a Fortune event actually said, we cannot de-extinct dinosaurs, and like Reddit like took off, and they were like, they gave her like, you know, negative Nancy Saurus or something like that name. I forgot exactly what the name was, just because she said, hey, we can't do this. Sorry.
How far away are we from seeing a woolly mammoth and a dodo again?
So the three questions we get all the time is, when are we going to see it? Can we make dinosaurs? And you know, which we've hinted on. And then the last one is, what's next? I was like, well, can't we get a couple of these out before everyone keeps asking us what's the next animal? I love the bullishness that society has in our success, which is like one of the number one questions is, what's the next animal? I was like, well, let's get one of these out. So our goal is still 2028 for the mammoth. I feel like we are on track. We announced our induced pluripotent stem cells this year for the mammoth. I feel very good about the prospect of kind of where we are. We have some updates coming out on the thylacine. We have one big update coming out on the dodo at the end of the year. We have not set a timeline for the dodo. We've not set a externally, I should say. We've not set a timeline externally for the thylacine. But what I will say is that, with 22 months of gestation for elephants, it is highly likely we will see an animal before the mammoth.
So explain the science to me behind how you're using this ancient DNA to make this happen.
We basically go out and go to museums and go out into the field, and we get ancient DNA, which is highly fragmented. And then we use AI and software and a bunch of tools to reassemble a bunch of pieces of that DNA to kind of build a reference genome for that extinct species. And then we compare that to the genome of its closest living relative. So in the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant. It's 99.6% the same genetically. It's kind of fun to know this, but mammoths are actually closer genetically to Asian elephants than Asian elephants are to African elephants. That fact sometimes blows people's minds. And then once we understand what genes really made a mammoth, we're not trying to clone mammoths. We're not trying to, assemble full, complete genomes and synthesize them. We're trying to identify the core genes that have been lost to time that drive the phenotypes or physical attributes, like what made a mammoth shaggy coat, what gave it this subcutaneous fat layer, what gave it the curved tusk and dome cranium, and then with that and the resulting pathways, how do we engineer those into the cell line of an Asian elephant? And then from there, we use a process called cloning, also known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, to take that edited nucleus in that cell, put it in that of an egg cell, and then we put it into its closest living relative. In the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant. And then if we're successful, 22 months later, we get a birth of a little baby mammoth.
And with the dodo, it's the pigeon, right?
Yes, it's the Nicobar pigeon, which if you look at pictures of what we think dodos look like, and you look at pictures of the Nicobar, you're like, there's no way that this is the closest living relative, because the Nicobar looks like this beautiful rainbow peacock pigeon. Like when I think of a pigeon, I think of like New York pigeons and like street rats or flying rat, and you're just like, oh my gosh, these are disgusting in some ways. But then when you see the pink pigeon, which is endemic to Mauritius, or the Nicobar pigeon, you're like, wow, these are actually beautiful, incredible birds.
So it's very exciting. You've got these exciting projects.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
What is next then?
Yeah, next is just delivering on our promises, right? It's like if we can save a couple critically endangered species, bring back a few extinct species, and then just continuing to expand our portfolio of species that we're helping and species that we're bringing back. I think that's what's next. I think we have a very clear roadmap for what the next 15 years looks like.
In The Urbanist this week, Monocle's David Stevens reported from the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat International Conference in London. One of his guests was Lei Biap, the Group Director of Architecture and Urban Design with the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore, and she explained a few things she thought the city-state was doing right.
Singapore started, we had a vision of working towards being a garden city. Right, and then it became City in a Garden. Now our latest vision is towards a city in nature. So greenery has been a very kind of integral part of our planning story. And over the years, I think we have also worked on different levels of design strategies on the ground, even roadside planting. It is something that the different agencies like National Parks Board put in a great deal of effort to, basically line the roads with beautiful trees. For development parcel, that's where the work of your area comes in. We draw up guidelines, either through development control guidelines or urban design guidelines to guide the developments to provide additional role of building setback with additional row of trees and so forth. We also have policies to encourage a developer and architect to design privately owned public spaces within that development. So this is on the ground. As the building gets higher, we also have this policy called LUSH. Basically, is to guide developer and architect to replace their amount of site area that they displaced, right, because they are building the project, and to have it replaced in different forms. It could be balconies, sky terraces, planter boxes, vertical green, and so forth. And by doing so, these additional greenery or largely landscape public spaces become additional elevated public space for everybody to enjoy. Of course, while we give this as a kind of incentive, meaning we don't count them as chargeable floor area or commercial floor area, but the condition is that they have to keep it publicly accessible such that everybody in the city can come out and enjoy these accessible public spaces.
I wonder too how Singapore manages to keep hold of some of its heritage buildings and the styles, the public housing, the hawker centres, structures where you can live and work and play and eat all in one space. How does Singapore hold on to those things that make it Singapore?
So fortunately for us, while we don't have that much space, it means that we are also need to plan everything in a very efficient manner. So hence looking at transportation, pedestrian connectivity, how far should they walk to the next hawker centre. All this become part of the kind of tools and provision that we looked at as we plan each neighbourhood. So with all this in mind, the design thinking is to also use some of these evidence-based design tools to really help us look at the distribution, where they should be, and after we do the kind of general planning, we then go down to the details. How accessible these places are? Is there a level difference between the roads and the building? How do we make it seamlessly for someone on a wheelchair or someone pushing a pram to be able to walk in the city in a comfortable manner? So these are all the kind of different levels of design review, should we say, that we have with architects, and hopefully in due time, every single project will kind of able to, like a jigsaw puzzle, plugged in and contribute, there are different range of amenities to offer to the local community.
And you touched on it a bit there about people with different mobility needs. You talked about the ageing population. That's a lesson that certainly a lot of cities will need to start thinking about. Singapore's already started thinking about it. What are some of those lessons that Singapore can pass on to cities about to deal with that same issue?
Yes, I think we do recognize that mobility is important. So having public transport is key, making sure the amenities are accessible. Every parks and open space is planned within less than 10 minutes walk, from their homes. Likewise for public transport stations. And through all these different measures, we hope we really create a kind of more friendlier environment for the aging population. And it's not just about transport, it's also about the environment. The amount of greenery, having playgrounds, senior care centres next to childcare centres, right? So you have kind of promote this intergenerational interactions. Polyclinics, either within walking distance, or we do have some projects where we call the integrated hub, where every of these amenities are in a way co-located within the same plot. Some might even have residential projects like Kampong Admiralty by Woha Architect. It's a fantastic example of how that can in a way integrate all the different users all under one roof, complete with public space and roof terrace. So it is a good project to demonstrate how some of these planning and design strategies all come into play.
No other cocktail is as classic and revered as a martini. This humble drink is considered the hallmark of a good bar and a master bartender. Whether you prefer it vodka or gin, dry or clean, shaken or stirred, the martini actually takes on many forms. In her new book, The Martini, writer Alice Lascelles has compiled 60 different versions of the drink, some more traditional, others a little more experimental. From grand New York hotel bars to little nooks on Tokyo's alleys, the martini belongs in many contexts. And to celebrate them all and the history of the drink itself, Alice joined us in the studio. She also brought along tools of the trade and a punchy sample. Chiara Ramella started things off by asking why she has such a passion for this specific cocktail.
Well, first of all, the martini is my favourite cocktail, so doing this book has just been a joy from beginning to end. But I think the more you unpick the martini, the more you realise it's a drink full of so many stories and variations, and all those variations are so sort of compelling, and I think people love debating this drink. So it's a story that never ends, really. It's both a sort of icon, but it's also a really personal drink as well, as personal as how you take your tea.
I think it's really interesting that it's something that is so fundamentally simple and basic, and yet there are so many variations of it, so many that you filled a whole book with them.
Yeah, I've got over 60 different variations.
But I suppose, where do the differences actually lie? And what makes a good martini versus a bad martini?
The number one rule that I would like people to take away from this book is use a frozen glass. I think that's the easiest way to upgrade any martini, or at the very least have everything as cold as possible. That's essential. You can use the nicest ingredients you like. You can mix the best formula, but if it's not a cold drink, it's not a martini in my book. I think you're always looking at the sort of essence of a martini. It's got to be clean, pure, strong, and a clear spirit, probably gin or vodka, but I have got a tequila and a light rum sort of martini in there as well. And then you need your aromatized or fortified wines, your vermouth or sherry, something like that to sort of season it. And then usually some kind of garnish, citrus, olive, something like that, just to really make it pop. But there are so many different ways that you can play that very, very simple recipe.
Are you allowed to play, or are the purists quite strict when it comes to a classic's a classic? You can't mess with it. You've obviously played around with it, but is it allowed, or are the purists a bit upset by the idea of changing it around?
Well, I mean, there definitely are people who have wrangled endlessly about what the perfect formula is, particularly in sort of the mid-20th century. There were a lot of kind of middle-aged white guys who argued a lot about what the perfect ratio of gin to vermouth was, really getting down to the decimal point. But I mean, and it's a question I get asked a lot, like, what is the perfect martini? And I'm afraid I'm going to dodge the question a bit and say my perfect martini changes from day to day and sometimes over the course of an evening as well. Simply just changing the gin or the variety of vermouth or the garnish I'm using, or the glass, perhaps. It can totally reinvent the drink, and that's why it's interesting.
You also said, rightly, that it's one of the few drinks where really the drinker is asked, how do you like it? You know, it does change according to the drinker and also to whoever's making it, but it's a kind of two-way conversation. Obviously, the first question I have to ask you is, what's the kind of martini you drink most often, or how do you like yours most often, given that you've just said that it changes depending on mood and occasion? And also, I suppose, what does that do to the relationship between the person behind and in front of the bar?
Well, I suppose my sort of benchmark formula would be a 5-to-1, so 5 parts gin, 1 part vermouth. I would sort of default to a classic London dry gin, something like Tanqueray or Beefeater or Plymouth I love as well, although there are some great new wave gins too. Love Noilly Prat for dry vermouth, but, you know, something quite mainstream like Martini Extra Dry can actually be great if you want a slightly sort of cleaner, fresher tasting martini. Sometimes a dash of orange bitters as well, which is something people used to do up until Prohibition, and then it died out. But I really like that as well. And then when it comes to the garnish, love an olive, love a twist though as well. And sometimes I will have both, which I know some people find very shocking indeed.
Uncouth.
But that question about personalisation, I think it's actually a trend that we're seeing across a lot of luxury industries at the moment. If you look at sort of fragrance, for example, or, I don't know, fashion or luggage, personalisation is a really big trend. And the martini is the ultimate sort of personalised drink. And you can have, like people now do in fragrance, a repertoire of fragrances that they wear. You can have a range of different gins and vermouths and play around with those and really make that iconic drink yours.
I'd like to talk about one of the words that you use, which is luxury. Because when you conjure up the image of a martini in your head, frequently it is associated with the grandeur and glamour of a 5-star hotel bar, and many of the most famous martinis in the world do come from that type of atmosphere. But in your book you also say that the martini belongs there, but it also belongs in the kitchen at a party at your house. Where do you think the martini sits in this kind of democratization type of spectrum? Do you think that it is nice for it to be associated with this old world of glamour, and it is something that we tap into, and it's nice for it to retain this kind of aura of aspiration around it? Where does it sit on this scale?
There is definitely an aura to this drink, and I think just someone saying to you, should we have a martini? Immediately you feel excited, don't you, and sort of in cahoots together. So there's definitely a sense of occasion about this drink, and that is why, you know, so many people are now prepared to go to somewhere like the Connaught Bar and drop £35 on a martini that's probably not made with massively expensive ingredients, but it's everything that goes around it, the amazing glassware and, you know, the ritual and feeling special. And maybe just having that one amazing drink rather than several drinks, or even going out for dinner, you know, that's the occasion. But then I've definitely noticed, you know, there's another side to the martini. You see it a lot in America as well. America's particularly good at doing that kind of more low-rent martini, you know, where you're having it with like fries or a burger or something like that, or in an airport. And I think that high-low sort of mash-up can be really fun and feel kind of decadent.
There's also no other cocktail, I think, that has the same kind of cultural life, really, or appearance in pop culture. And you talk about that a bit in the book. But obviously I was familiar with the James Bond kind of connotations, but it also appears in cinema. So can you tell us where you have traced it through kind of popular culture in the 21st century?
Well, I think it is a sort of prism for its time, and every iteration of the martini tells you something about a different era. I mean, the fact that it has visually such a strong identity, that Y-shaped glass, which was launched at a big exposition in Paris in the 1920s, which was really the birthplace of Art Deco. You know, that glass like set a whole new tone to celebration, going out, kind of aspiration. It was actually originally designed as a champagne glass, but it was sort of co-opted by the cocktail of the day. And that martini, those clean lines, both in taste and visually, sort of really captured this new age of speed and dynamism and fantastic engineering. You know, it's a really engineered kind of a cocktail. So I think that's really carried through over the decades since then.
Well, that's all we've got time for on this edition of The Curator. The show is produced by David Stevens and presented by me, Laura Kramer. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best programs here on Monocle Radio. That's it from me. Thanks for listening.